So with all of these differences, with all of these manuscripts, how many differences are there? Throughout the Middle Ages, it appears that scholars didn't realize that there was a problem of not having the original text, or very few scholars realized that this was a problem. Even the scribes copying the text, they sometimes would realize there were differences in the manuscripts they were copying, but they didn't make a very big deal about it. The first time somebody made a really big deal about this was exactly 300 years ago this year, in the year 1707. There was a scholar named John Mill at Oxford. I think he's unrelated to the Victorian John Stuart Mill. This John Mill was a scholar of the Bible, and he had spent 30 years looking at manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, this is obviously after the invention of printing, and printers have to decide what text they're going to print, and the problem is they've got manuscripts that have differences among them. And so how does the printer decide which manuscript to print? Well, it's a problem. That's when they started realizing that this was an issue. Well, John Mill wanted to produce a printed edition of the Greek New Testament. He spent 30 years looking at the manuscripts available to him. He had available to him 100 manuscripts, approximately 100 manuscripts. And he printed up his edition of the Greek New Testament in which he'd give a verse, and then at the bottom of the page he would indicate the places where the manuscripts differed from one another for that verse. To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, when John Mill produced his edition of the Greek New Testament, it included an apparatus at the bottom of the page that cited 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. 30,000 places where there were manuscript variations among the manuscripts that he had discovered. And the striking thing is John Mill didn't give all of the differences he found. He only cited the differences that he thought were significant. Some of his detractors claimed that John Mill was working to render the text of Scripture uncertain. His supporters pointed out that he didn't create these differences. He simply noticed that they exist. So what do we know today about the numbers of mistakes in our manuscripts? Well, Mill looked at 100 manuscripts, and now we have 5,700 manuscripts. Nobody knows how many differences there are among the manuscripts that we now have, because nobody yet, even with the development of computer technologies, nobody has been able to add up all of the differences. Sometimes scholars guess there may be a couple 100,000 differences. Some people say 300,000, some say 400,000. There are different guesses. The way I usually put it to my students is in comparative terms. There are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. More differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.